King Arthur, the legendary King of Britain, has captured the imagination of millions for centuries. The Knights of the Round Table, the magical sword Excalibur, Arthur's love triangle with Queen Guinevere and Sir Lancelot, and the quest for the Holy Grail are all tales almost everyone in the world knows. Arthurian stories of magic, war, love, and loss have been told and retold in countless versions over the centuries. From 13th century French romances, to T.H. White's 1958 novel The Once and Future King, to even satires like Monty Python and the Holy Grail. There's something in the Arthur legend for everyone, says Leah Tether, professor of medieval literature at the University of Bristol. The stories have flawed characters with whom we can empathize, quests to achieve impossible goals, and an adaptable storyline that fits the socio-political landscape of the time. Of course, all this attention on the Arthurian legends brings up an interesting question. Was King Arthur a real person? Throughout history, people seem to think so. For instance, in 1233, Prince Richard, the Earl of Cornwall, built a castle in Tintagel, a small village that was believed to be the birthplace of Arthur. The castle served no military or commercial purpose, and was built simply to honor the famous king. Many scholars throughout time believed there was a historical Arthur as well, while many others, the majority frankly, are convinced he was a myth, or are at least agnostic on the subject. So in this video, we'll look at the history of the Arthurian legends to see if Arthurian literature can give us any clues, and then we'll look at a few historical figures who some have claimed were the inspiration for King Arthur. This video is brought to you by my Patreon. If you want to support the channel monetarily, please head over to my Patreon where you can get all of my videos a couple days early, ad-free. If you go up to the Earl/Countess or Duke/Duchess tiers, you'll also be credited at the end of all my videos. So please, if you have the desire and ability to support me, please consider heading over to patreon.com/generalistpapers, or click the link in the description or pinned comment. Thanks a bunch. Now back to the video. The first mention of Arthur in the historical record is from 829, in the work Historia Brittonum. It was purportedly written by a Welsh clergyman named Nennius, though some scholars doubt his authorship. The work mentions Arthur as a military commander, not explicitly a king, who fought against the invading Saxons in the 6th century. 12 battles are listed that Arthur fought and assumedly won, with the last battle being the Battle of Badon. The Battle of Badon had been mentioned elsewhere in medieval histories, for instance in On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain by Gildas. Gildas's work has historically been looked on as much more trustworthy than Historia Brittonum. Gildas does indeed mention the Battle of Badon, though he doesn't mention Arthur. He instead says a man named Ambrosius Aurelianus was the hero of the battle, a man whom later poets use as either another name for the wizard Merlin or as Arthur's uncle. So historians agree that the Battle of Badon happened, but the more trustworthy of these two works doesn't mention Arthur at all, and the one that does describes him as a military leader, not a king. The next important Arthurian work, perhaps the most important of them all, is Historia Regum Britannia, or The History of the Kings of Britain, by the Welsh clergyman and chronicler Geoffrey of Monmouth. It was written in 1136 and traces Britain's history back to its supposed founding by the Trojan exile Brutus, where Britain gets its name. In the book, Uther Pendragon, a king of Britain whom every historian agrees is entirely fictional, sleeps with a woman named Igraine, the wife of a local duke, after the wizard Merlin magically disguises Uther as her husband. The product of this union was Arthur, who later became king. He fought back the Saxons that his father had been warring with, and even conquered most of northern Europe. But when he was fighting the Romans in Gaul, his nephew Mordred married his queen Guinevere and seized control of Britain. Arthur returned to his home, killed Mordred, but was mortally wounded. He was then carried off to the Isle of Avalon to heal, and was never seen again. The Trojan connection existed in the earlier Historia Brittonum, but the rest is original to Geoffrey's work. It introduces a plethora of motifs that will pop up in later Arthurian stories, from the circumstances of his birth to his queen Guinevere and her unfaithfulness, and his enemy Mordred. Historia Regum Britannia was a huge success, and it started the craze of Arthurian stories that lasted the Middle Ages, becoming the first in what is known as the Matter of Britain, one of the three subjects of medieval romance and poetry, the other two being the Matter of France, stories involving Charlemagne and his paladins, and the Matter of Rome, stories from Greco-Roman mythology and history. Medieval romances, mostly of French origin, were written en masse, introducing the world to the Knights of the Round Table, Lancelot, Camelot, Excalibur, the quest for the Holy Grail, and much more. The definitive English version of the legend comes from Sir Thomas Malory's La Morte d'Arthur, written in 1485. These later stories, while great, are all clearly fictional, involving magic, dragons, and other mythical elements. And scholars agree that Geoffrey of Monmouth's work was likewise legendary in nature and not historically accurate. So it is the earlier works, like Historia Britannum, that we have to work with. So now that we've gone through the literature on King Arthur and his knights, we can move on to some of the historical candidates for the real Arthur. There are a plethora of theories, but we'll only go over a few. Let's start with Lucius Artorius Castus. He was a Roman military commander living around the late 2nd century who served as a prefect of a legion stationed in Britain, which at the time was a Roman province. He is mentioned on 2 inscriptions found in Dalmatia, modern-day Croatia. These inscriptions were memorial plaques that would have been in front of his sarcophagus. Here's the translation of the longer one if you want to read it. Some of the inscription is missing, so experts have done their best to reconstruct it. Also, there are some questions about the correct way to translate it, but the only part that we care about is here, that he was a prefect of the 6th Legion Victrix stationed in Britain. A prefect was the 3rd in command of a legion, so pretty high up. The scholar Kemp Malone was the first to propose the L. Artorius Castus theory, and it has been championed by the likes of Linda Malcor and John Matthews in their book Artorius, The Real King Arthur. Unfortunately, the majority of historians aren't convinced. First, the life of L. Artorius Castus is not particularly similar to that of King Arthur. The only real connections are the name and the fact that he was a military commander in Britain. He lived too early to have fought the Saxons, and there's no evidence that his time in Britain was particularly noteworthy either, as there were no major wars or battles during his stay there. The name Arthur probably did come from the Roman name Artorius, but it could have been of Celtic origin as well. L. Artorius Castus is the only Artorius to have lived in Britain during Roman rule that we know of, so maybe the name did come from him. The problem is that he wouldn't have gone by the name Artorius. That was a family name, or a clan name. His given name was Castus, and that's how he would have been known. Personally, while I do think it possible that the name Arthur may have made its way to the shores of Britain from Castus, I don't think there's sufficient evidence that his time in Britain would have inspired the legends of Arthur. So we've looked at a possible Roman Arthur. What about a British one? Well, some historians, like Geoffrey Ashe, have pointed to the late 5th century king Riothamus. Most of our information on him comes from the Byzantine historian Jordanes, who names him a king of the Britons. Riothamus fought the Visigoths in Gaul, modern-day France, at the behest of the Western Roman Emperor Anthemius. In Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britannia, King Arthur is said to have gone to war in Gaul twice, once to assist the Romans and once to quell a civil war. This seems to be in line with Riothamus' story. There are a few problems, however. First, we don't know that Riothamus was a king in Britain. You see, the term Britons referred to multiple different groups of people at the time, one of which was in Armorica, modern-day Brittany in France. We have a letter written to Riothamus by Sidonius Apollinaris, who was Bishop of Clermont, complaining that a number of slaves had been escaping and enlisting in Riothamus' army. The letter has a friendly and familiar tone, and as we know Apollinaris had no connection to Britain, it seems likely that Riothamus was not a king in Britain, but instead in Armorica. Jordanes does say that Riothamus crossed the ocean to get to the Visigoths, which seems to indicate that he was traveling from Britain, but it's possible he traveled by boat down the coast of France instead. Honestly, we just don't know where he was king. But even if he was king on the island of Britain, that's not where the problems stop. First, there is no indication that Riothamus fought any battles against the Saxons, like Historia Britannum says. Arthur's exploits in Gaul don't show up until Historia Regum Britannia, which historians agree is a much less trustworthy source. Secondly, we have the problem of the name. Riothamus is named Riothamus, not Arthur. Some have argued that Riothamus was a title, because in the Brythonic language, Riothamus roughly translates to Great King or Kingliest. This sounds promising, except there's no reason to think Riothamus was a title and not a name. Jordanes refers to him as King Riothamus, so by this theory he would be King Great King, which doesn't make much sense. Also in the letter by Sidonius Apollinaris, he's referred to as my friend Riothamus, which indicates this was simply his name. So once again, while the Riothamus connection is, in my opinion, more likely than that of L. Artorius Castus, it falls short of being a proper explanation. So where does that leave us? Well, on the whole, I would say there are four main theories about the historicity of King Arthur. The first is that Nennius, or a predecessor who acted as his source, made up the figure of Arthur as a British hero in opposition to the Saxons. The second is that Arthur was based on a historical figure, like L. Artorius Castus or Riothamus, or a number of other figures that have been put forward. The third is that Arthur didn't exist, but had his basis in Welsh or Celtic mythology. I didn't go over this theory because while it's interesting to think about, there just isn't any evidence of a god or demigod named Arthur in the record, though I suppose it could have been lost to time. And the fourth theory is that Nennius was right. There was a man named Arthur who fought the Saxons, and for some reason the only mention of him is from Nennius 300 years after he supposedly lived. Historians are mostly agnostic on the question of Arthur, but I think most of them lean towards the first explanation, that he was and is an entirely fictional creation. But I can't help but favor the fourth theory. I don't believe it that far-fetched, that there was perhaps a man named Arthur who lived in the 5th century, fought the Saxons, and whose story was kept alive through word of mouth until Nennius finally wrote about him in his Historia Britannum. My real thoughts on the subject is that it doesn't really matter. Even if Arthur did exist, he was not the King Arthur that we know and love. There was no Merlin, no Round Table, no Excalibur, no stories of love and betrayal, no Holy Grail. The wonderful parts of the Arthurian legends are just that, legends, and whether or not Arthur was flesh and blood doesn't really add or take away from our enjoyment of his stories. So what do you think? Do you believe that King Arthur existed, or is he merely a figure of legend? Let me know in the comments. Also, please like and subscribe, and if you want to monetarily support the channel, head over to my Patreon. The link is in the description. Thanks a lot for watching. Bye!